That's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. Right, they've lowered the level of technology for our session, so that should work. That should be fine. There's some fancy system for collecting questions from the audience.
Yes.
It's going to reel up here, but
Yeah.
they've decided not to.
Well, that Slido, yes, it was playing up
The innovation
yesterday.
of technology is gone.
But also, there was a
of our energy systems with a global perspective. So clearly of interest to the UK, but we're going to take I think a broader perspective than that. So we have a really exciting and interesting panel, and I'm afraid I'm going to take the lazy option of asking them to introduce themselves. So let me start with Matthew Wright from Ørsted.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Matthew Wright. I'm UK Managing Director for Ørsted. Many of you may know that we changed our name to Ørsted from Dong Energy last year when we sold the ONG, the oil and natural gas that was in Dong, Danish oil and natural gas. Changed our company name to Ørsted because we didn't think D really had much of a ring to it. More than that signalled something that had been happening in our company for a number of years before that. Back in 2016, we had announced that we were sort of moving away from coal and we'll be completely coal-free by 2023. And we sold our oil and natural gas business and we've become a pure-play renewable energy company. And our vision is to create a world that runs entirely on green energy. So we are 100% committed to the energy transition. We are the world's leading and UK's leading offshore wind developer. We inaugurated, as the Baroness mentioned, our 10th UK project at Racebank last week. Proud day indeed. And just to echo some of the comments that were made earlier, that day was not so much about the asset, you can't even see the asset, it's so far offshore, but it was really about the transformational effect of offshore wind on places, and in that case, Grimsby and the Humber, and it was really exciting and a really proud day for us. In addition to offshore wind, we have started a storage business and a solar business. We also have a first-of-a-kind waste-to-energy plant that we've built in Northwich in Cheshire. We have a thriving commercial and industrial energy sales business where we focus particularly on flexibility products and the demand side. And all of these things are really part of the jigsaw that will one day become a world that runs entirely on green energy.
Thank you for that inspiring little speech, Matthew.
Thank you very much.
Claire, he's going to cause you at National Grid all sorts of problems, isn't he? But Claire, do tell us about yourself and National Grid first.
Morning, everyone. I'm Claire Spedding. I'm Head of Business Development for the Electricity System Operator at National Grid. Before that, I ran commercial operations at National Control in Wokingham, and I did that role 3 years ago. So I've really lived through the transition that we've all been talking about and have the scars to prove it. As been mentioned several times already, 2-3 years ago, we'd have never have been talking about no coal being on the system as soon as it has been. It's been a super exciting time from a system operator point of view in terms of challenges and new things that we're having to deal with and embrace and take forward. In my current role as Head of Business Development, I'm responsible for facilitating the transition to a decarbonised, decentralised and digitised electricity system. So that is everything from demand-side response to incorporating battery technology onto the grid to looking at how wind increases its operation on the grid, both in terms of a relatively straightforward megawatt contribution, but also how additional revenue streams can be opened up for wind providers. So things for offshore wind particularly would be frequency response, for onshore wind probably also incorporating voltage support and things like that.
Thank you very much, Claire. So then we move on to Clark McFarlane from Siemens.
Siemens Gamesa, Julia. Even I'm still getting used to it, don't worry about it. But actually, I don't know Claire, but Claire's just, I'm going to have a coffee with Claire afterwards, because this won't mean anything to you, but I live in Bearwood Road.
Ah.
And there you go. So the centre at Wokingham that Claire was just talking about, I live about 200 metres from, and it's a big black box. You can't get in it. I've always wondered what's in there and what are they doing. I knew it belonged to National Grid, and you either go straight onto work or right to the golf course, and I've never gone left into that centre. So I'm going to quiz you afterwards, just as a local resident, as to what you're doing and how you're frying us there. Siemens Gamesa, I'm the UK Managing Director. We have about 2,500 people in the UK. That's from our manufacturing, our offshore, our onshore, and our service facilities based around the country. We had the pleasure last week of taking Julia to show her what UK manufacturing looked like and what an O&M centre looked like, to try and familiarise herself with the industry. We did a joint merger with Gamesa. That was on April the 3rd last year, so we're just a year into that, which is part of a consolidation we've seen within OEMs, both in onshore and offshore. So many of you may have gone through that exercise. It's been a very interesting exercise, not for today's panel. And clearly we were part of the Siemens family, and part of the Siemens family was a very interesting place to be, because you had a combined cycle business, you have an energy transmission and distribution business, so you can imagine how many of the debates of this sort we had about decarbonising the economy and what a transmission and distribution system looks like. I have been, on the 1st September this year, 36 years in the electricity industry, so I am quite the diverse part of the panel in that I'm older than most people, but I've seen a lot of development because when I started, it was the CEGB and the standards and that. So I'll give you my point of view as to what I've seen us heading towards and where I think we're going next.
You're finally in the right part of the industry.
It's taken me to my mid-50s to get to the sexy end of an industry.
And then we have Sebastian Bringsward from Equinor, who brings a very international view, I think, to our panel.
Thank you. As you all figured out, I'm not Irene, and unfortunately she couldn't be here. So I'm heading up the floating effort in Equinor, and I guess we have some of the same story you had a year ago or so with the name change. We used to be Statoil, and now we're Equinor, and we went through kind of 4 years ago a transition, a really kind of a reset of our strategy and looking into the future energy system and really established the new energy solution business area where Irene is heading it up and I work with the floating part. And I think the kind of looking into the crystal ball and seeing where is kind of the energy market moving, we really saw the need for stepping up our effort into renewables. We still will have our oil and gas assets, and I think the kind of combination both from a competence view and from asset-based view is still our core strategy. But with the name change, roughly a month ago, I think our CEO made a very kind of clear consolidating the change. We are not an oil and gas company, we are an energy company. So I think that's the core. And then obviously we have very exciting business in the UK, which is our core offshore market, and we are really looking forward to what's happening now this spring, and also on the exciting stuff on floating in the UK.
So can I start with the first question, which is really where we're pushing very hard on this sector deal message about we need this clear pathway to 30 gigawatts, and then we'd like to go to 50 gigawatts by 2050. So is this really achievable? Can we deliver it?
I'll start. Yes. Next question. Yeah, I mean, certainly we can deliver it from the perspective of the industry's capability to deliver that volume of projects. It would represent, I think, as you had in your sort of earlier projections, sort of getting to 20 gigawatts by 2030 anyway. So it's kind of going from about 1 gigawatt a year to about 2 through the 2020s. Definitely achievable. From a grid perspective, I mean, interesting in Claire's views, but I've seen any number of dispatch models and the sort of clever folks that model the energy system and the mix that might be on the system in that time frame, and it certainly looks like 30 gigs could be accommodated within the system. As the Baroness mentioned in her introduction, we've got countries in the world that already have more than that in the mix, so it must be possible, and without significant curtailment of wind or at that level. So it's technically feasible. The capacity can be there. I think the benefits could be enormous to UK PLC because of all the reasons that the sector deal has sort of highlighted, not the least of which the benefits to the UK supply chain and its competitiveness internationally. And, unsurprisingly, we are enthusiastic supporters of that vision.
So, Claire, it's what do you see as what are your biggest concerns, or what are your biggest exciting opportunities at Grid in moving towards this?
So I would start off and echo the point that yes, we think it's possible. We have done some modelling, so the numbers show that 30 gigawatts is manageable on the grid. We don't see an issue with that.
Do you see the costs of integrating starting to rise significantly as we get towards 30, or?
I think what's interesting is that a rise in offshore wind is happening at the same time of lots of other things. So other technologies rapidly increasing their penetration on the grid, particularly batteries, and also with increasing move towards decentralised energy and digitisation. But they all work together in quite a nice way, and what Grid is doing and what's a really exciting opportunity for us is that we're focusing on opening up markets. So the markets that exist in the electricity industry at the minute have quite a lot of barriers to entry to them because they've grown with how the industry has grown, and they have historically been geared towards the more traditional players in the market. But by opening those up, we can increase the value proposition for renewable technologies, including offshore wind, by opening up additional revenue streams that can be accessed, which obviously is a benefit to the industry, but has a benefit to the grid as well, in that it enables us to start exploring how different technologies can support the physics of the system, where previously we've relied on just one. So an example I always use is the black start of the grid. So if we were ever in a partial or total shutdown situation, historically, we've always procured that capability from thermal generating plants. But by opening markets up and encouraging the growth of new technologies, we can start to explore in partnership with people how those technologies can contribute to the grid in different ways and create more competitive markets, which, coming back to your slides, only serves to lower cost to consumers. So yes, there might be a cost to integration, but by opening up the markets into a more liquid environment, that should ultimately lead to lower cost to consumers.
But how are you going to wean some of your colleagues off the reassurance they get from large, heavy pieces of rotating machinery in terms of frequency management?
So that is fundamentally my job. So
right.
It was described last week as turning the oil tanker. I know that there is a view of National Grid can be seen as a bit of a dinosaur and hides behind the walls. But actually, it's really not. And what I've been surprised about is how willing everyone is to embrace the technology and how things are changing. To some extent, we've had to. So the penetration of solar onto the system was so rapid. I don't think anyone really expected it to happen as quickly as it did. So we had to get comfortable with that very quickly. But that's only served to prove that things can change and they can be different and everything's still okay. So there's a bit around kind of supporting people and doing the modelling to prove that it's okay, but we also do quite a lot of activity where we bring technology providers or kind of business models like aggregators in and get them talking to particularly the control engineers in national control, and just getting them familiar with the technology and how it operates. And it's amazing how quickly that gets people comfortable with what they're seeing on the bars.
So are there some big investments you're going to be needing?
I think for grid, particularly for the system operator, particularly, what's most relevant for me at the minute is IT. So how we integrate everything from an IT point of view into our dispatch systems. So moving from a world where we've had, can count on your fingers a number of big generators that we can dispatch to lots and lots of small things, or going through an OFTO or whatever. So IT is the big thing for me, but we're already working on that. So.
And artificial intelligence as well, presumably, to go with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So artificial intelligence we're already using at national control. So we supplement our demand forecast with AI. So we kind of have always forecasted demand in the same way that every other system operator does with the weather data that we get from our provider. But obviously as you increase your penetration of renewables, your forecast can be wrong very quickly because the weather front will come in a bit slower or it will come in a slightly different direction. So we're supplementing that now with AI, which runs in the background and updates our forecasts.
And do you do much exchange of experience and knowledge with your overseas counterparts, or are our grids all so different internationally that you haven't got
They
direct
are
comparators?
different. The GB grid is very different, particularly to continental Europe, but there's still a lot that we can learn from each other. We do a lot of information sharing with California, more on solar. Some of the European grids obviously have more experience of integrating wind. So yeah, we do. There's quite a few. I'm sure some of you have been involved, but cross-industry transmission operator groups where we're actively sharing that information.
Sebastian, you look as if you're keen to come in on that one.
Just to comment. This day, yesterday, our Batwin battery arrived at Peterhead, which we're going to connect to Highwind Scotland to test out really how this is going to work, both from a business perspective and what kind of value creation can we make around this, and can we do kind of value stacking, and what kind of services can we tap into. And we're behind the meter, by the way, so we want to integrate it with our Highwind Scotland. And I think one of the key things also, which is mentioned on the kind of sector deal, is the pipeline and the predictability. And what we see now is really that kind of, we need a policy for this. We need to understand the regulatory framework to really be able to implement a storage solution and to start building the business models around it. So it's a little bit like if kind of leaning back and saying, okay, come with a proposal on what you're going to do, and we're going to say whether we're going to allow it or not. It's not going to kind of accelerate the deployment of storage. We need some kind of forward-leaning, yes, this is kind of a foreign sea policy or regulatory frameworks which you can rely on. And I think that's important. That's where we are in the midst of now with Batwin. How are we going to make it work, and how are we going to make it work in the system and commercially and technically? So proactive policy and predictable pipeline of what you see is the message from us there.
Do you want to comment on the regulatory side, Claire?
So I was just going to say I won't speak for the regulator, but historically these types of projects have been bankable because they've had a long-term contract underpinning them, and we're just not in a position to do that now, I don't think, because the market's moving too quickly, and it wouldn't be appropriate to sign long-term contracts, the worst case scenario being that actually stifles innovation and stops the prices moving. But I completely agree with you. What's really important, if we're not doing that, is then making sure that we can help with the predictability of revenues. So how do we see the system evolving, what's the need for services, what's going to be the contribution to the generation mix, and what impact does that have, and helping to shape that picture. So that's what becomes your bankable business case rather than a traditional long-term contract.
And Clark, are you looking forward to building lots more blade factories for this?
What's more blade
growth,
factories?
well, yeah, you seem to be full when I came round.
So 30 gigawatts by 2030. I don't think that's a problem. I think 2 gigawatts per year from what capacity we've got. Depends on globalization, what volumes become from the 2025 onwards. That then might become a challenge for global capacity. So it isn't just yes, it'll be no problem. Some of us will have to work hard with it. In terms of the grid system, I actually don't think that between now and 2030 it's a technical problem. I think there are other problems that we should be concentrating upon, and I think Sebastian and Claire have tried to address them. We've seen people say you couldn't run without coal. You can't run without coal. It's impossible. You need the base load. Well, that's rubbish, isn't it? We've been able to do that. We've had 25 gigawatts of renewables on the system. And did any of the lights go out? Did any of the factories stop? No, it didn't. We know that the likes of Denmark or Sweden or Costa Rica, various places, have done 100% renewables on their grids. Yes, they've got interconnectors, so it's a slightly different grid system that they're operating on. But we know that technically that it is feasible within certain markets. So there isn't a technical, for me, impediment when we get to 30 gigawatts. I do think there is a technical challenge when you then want to go from 30 to 50. And now remember, that's a new 50 because you'll be decommissioning and you'll be replacing. And I think that's when we might have to do technical challenges. I think on the grid side, the next 10, 12 years, we have different challenges. So the challenges for me are storage, physically located or not physically located. Who owns? Who runs? Where are the intensive users? So much of the frequency balancing. So I sat, my first commissioned turbine was 1984 in Drax. You know, I was clearly 3-year-old then. Yeah. And that was a job trying to synchronize on the grid. And the grid, as you know, is the intensive users. And when the intensive users come on, that's when the frequency response struggles. And I think we've got a job to do to try and identify how storage and how a modern grid fits with the intensive users that we've got within the grid. So I think actually, for me, not that Claire and her team are not doing a wonderful job, I think there are different questions we need to ask between now and 2030, and I think there are a different set of questions that we ask from 2030 onwards.
So what are your key questions for 2030 and your key questions for beyond 2030?
So my key questions to 2030 are identify intensive users and how can we provide a stable load for intensive users. And are they going to digitise or are they going to require a more traditional load? So I'm thinking of the steel industries, I'm thinking of people like ourselves who are balancing facilities, who have got a peak load ability. How are we going to keep those key parts of British industry going? I'm very interested in how we're going to work storage. So as a turbine supplier, are we producing the electricity straight to the grid, as we're doing at the moment, and therefore the turbine controls, the converters, you know, and the transmission system and what harmonic filters you put in there, they're matched to what the grid demands. That's not necessarily the same as a storage mechanism, and depending on which storage mechanism.
Which was the thing Sebastian was.
Yeah.
Was
So you might need different power electronics coming out depending on where you think you're feeding to. That would be more of a challenge to us as a turbine supplier. And just exactly where are you expecting us to load up? And then there is I think the industry at the moment is trying to answer the question of storage. And one of the things we're doing is doing batteries only, and we're doing it located within wind farms. And I question why, you know, particularly if we want to do them some onshore wind farms, why would you take a boatload of heavy batteries up the side of a hill when you can actually produce electricity and send it to something more sensible? And the ownership of it and then the running of it, I think, needs a little bit of a think about, which is difficult under offshore regimes in terms of offshore wind. But that is the policy that I think we need to start thinking about. Because then when we've got that policy clear, by the way, I don't think batteries will be the end. Battery, we've got ammonia solutions, there's geothermal solutions. If you think battery solutions are the end of it, think about the first train. We put coal in that, and everybody thought that was the technology. It's not going to be the final answer. So answering those questions between now and 2030, I think, are the key ones.
Matthew, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I pretty much go along with that. Again, in the 2030 timeframe, there are some issues that need to be addressed. One of the aspects of the sector deal is that we're very much alive to that, and one of the proposals, one of the work streams actually in the sector deal is looking at how better we can integrate 30 gigawatts of wind into the system. So technically, yes, it's feasible, but it gives rise to some other issues, as Clark has outlined. And I think it's a responsible attitude for the sector to say, look, we are generating ostensibly a very renewable but also an intermittent resource. We should have an interest in terms of how that is integrated onto the system, rather than just saying, look, we generate it, we'll leave the system operator to sort of figure all of that out. We also have a battery kind of project. Hasn't got as good a name as Batwind. I mean, that's just fantastic. Ours is called the Burbo Bank Battery or something. Wish I'd come up with Batwind. Anyway, that's an aside. It's hardly a big regret, but it's a regret.
You got Ørsted.
Yeah.
Well, we got Ørsted, yeah, you're right. It's probably better than Equinor. Anyway.
You keep renaming things anyway, so we'll just have another name.
Yeah, that's true. We could call it something else. Yeah. Robin, maybe. I think our company certainly is looking at all the ways. I mean, Clark also then mentioned ammonia and hydrogen and other things. Certainly, the longer term, the 2050 system. Let's be honest, none of us knows what that's going to look like. And I think what I really love about the sector, genuinely love, is the innovation that's happening and the sort of thought that's going on about, okay, well, where might this go? And companies like Equinor and Ørsted and everybody sort of saying, okay, well, we don't know exactly how this is going to work, but you know what? We're going to commit anyway and try to sort of figure it out. So we're going to build a battery, and then we're going to figure out how we can up-regulate and down-regulate and provide frequency response and ancillary services, and then we'd be super keen in longer-term storage technologies as well, whether it's ammonia, hydrogen, or whatever, because ultimately, the train could well be a hydrogen train, as opposed to an electric train directly, none of us know the answers, but that's kind of what it makes it so interesting.
So where do you think you'll have got to on cost by 2030? We've got down to the average of whatever it is, £62 per megawatt hour. Where are we going to be by 2030?
Yeah. Less. I don't know. I mean, we've been on this kind of steep sort of and that has come about because of all the innovation, all the economies of scale, but fundamentally, that is about deployment. We were having this conversation upstairs, Sebastian and I, in the context of floating. What brings down the cost ultimately is deployment, is experience curve effects, is actually doing something over and over and over and getting better at it. And my God, we're getting pretty good at it. But who knows? We could still get better and bring down the cost. One of the really interesting things is, in the context of the sector deal, we have notionally £557 million as set aside for pot 2 in the clean growth strategy. If prices come down much more, you kind of start to go vertical on the sort of the volumes that you can get under that sort of that amount, because subject to where your assumptions about the wholesale energy price are and where they're going, you can get very large volumes. So it's not a money issue at this stage, or there are some issues around providing a sort of a bankable proposition and providing some certainty for investment. But yeah. Lost the thread. What was I talking about?
How much is it going to cost?
Yeah. I can't answer that directly.
The developer's not going to tell you what his next bid's going to be, is he? Let's be honest. But
I can try.
You can try. But I think
kind of what I meant.
I think the thing that's encouraging, though, is the way that the market's taken off and the way that the technology's developed. And anybody who's tried to plot how the cost reduction in the industry's happened, they know it's not a one activity. Some people talk about the fact that it's a bigger turbine. Well, it's not. I mean, there's lots of things in terms of modular structures, and the OTM's been different. They're no longer the local path. The logistics are very much different. The reliability is very much different. O&M, remote O&M, monitoring. There's a boatload of things which are in this industry, and a lot of people in this room, I'm sure, need to take credit for it. So you know, on behalf of the turbine suppliers, it's not just the fact that it's a bigger turbine. You know, please give everybody else the credit. 2 years ago, you may remember, there was all of us. We signed up to the fact that we were going to hit 75 by 2025. How stupid does that look now when you've got zero subsidy auctions in Germany and the Netherlands that have come through? But I think what Matthew said is it's deployment. What we've been able to do is create volume to industrialise in order to help with these technology development. And if we don't get an opportunity in order to put the industry into a volume position, and hopefully globalisation will help that, then you worry about the stagnation and the ability to afford the innovation in the industry. And that's why I think the sector deal is absolutely key, because you know, the more nations that we can have in order to get that volume certainty, then the cheaper it will be, and then the technology will change. And I was really encouraged by the EU, if you're allowed to say that sentence, where they've been revising the EU targets to higher renewables. I mean, I remember having a conversation with Ed David a few years ago when he had been to Brussels to try and get a 2030 target from the 2020 target, and he said, you know, he felt as if there was only 2 people in the room supporting him. They managed to get it to 27. They were talking about going to 35. They've ended up at 32. 32 is a pretty good target to start with. I'm sure that'll expand. And then that volume will come, and the prices will come down. And yeah, I think we've put it in the sector deal. We expect in the 2025 plus range that we'll see significant cost reductions to the consumer, and we'll even see the spread price come down, I think.
So, Sebastian, what's offshore? What's floating wind going to do for us? Is this going to be the next big step in cost reduction?
At least I can answer with a number on where I think we'll be in 2030. I mean, it's no secret that we really piggyback on what's happening on fixed and all the thing about industrialization and so. But then it's back to kind of how do you get there, and that's about deployment. And if we see a pipeline up towards the same as fixed have seen now, up to 10 gigawatt plus, we believe that we can be down on a 40 to 60 euro per megawatt hour in a 2030 scenario. Obviously, that will depend on a lot of things. And that's why I think that the 30 gigawatt sector deal is definitely something we believe in and support, and I think even further. And you need to kind of start planning for that now. That innovation will not happen. That kind of journey will not come down on cost if we don't start now. And that's why it's so encouraging to see what's happening with the Crown Estate Scotland now on the kind of lease process they're in, and I think we really need to kind of push for that. Obviously, it will take time, and we will not be competitive with bottom fixed the next 5 years, but we will definitely not be it the next 15 years when we really are needed if we don't start now. So I think that's the key message, and we really are engaged in the UK, and I think you have a great opportunity when you come back to the sector deal of being in the forefront. You are in the forefront with Hywind Scotland, but you have the opportunity to really take that advantage and also move it out of UK and be kind of an export part of it.
So you're going to have to do better than 40 euros per megawatt hour.
It's truth.
So what about, I'm a great EV enthusiast, having done the King Review for the Treasury many years ago. So do EVs and wind go well together, or are they a bit of a nightmare for you?
I think it's all part of a change in picture. I mean, the grid doesn't look anything today like it did 2 years ago, never mind 5 years ago. In 2 years' time, it probably won't look the same. In 5-10 years' time, it's definitely not going to look the same. I'm quite a big believer in technology, and that all of these different things, so an increase in wind, an increase in batteries, an increase in EVs can work together, but the technology needs to be there to enable it. What none of us have really mentioned, but is kind of going on underneath all of this, is the change in consumer behaviour, which will be partly around EVs, but you know, even simple things like people not really watching live TV anymore. They watch stuff on catch-up and stuff. It all changes how the electricity system works, and I think it can work together, but technology is the key for me to facilitating it.
So I think the philosophy behind the two definitely goes together. So I learn a lot from my kids that are in their 20s, and they just have a completely different approach to life. You know, autonomous vehicles, Uber-style future cars where they don't own cars and something turns up, charging something in a charging point, being part of a digitalised grid. You know, they just accept that's going to happen. You know, for me, I can't quite see how we change, but for them, they're going to accept that. And so I think a modern society, a digital way of capturing electricity, which I think renewables allows itself very easily to, and a distributed grid system, which has got EVs in it. I think the two match technologically, and I think the two match in terms of aspirational and culture in the way that we're having people innovate in both of those industries. I think our industry will become younger and more inventive as it has to link in with those technologies. So I think they're fundamental.
They certainly kind of have a psychological link, don't they? I mean, people who buy EVs want to think they're filling them up with clean electricity.
Absolutely.
I mean, the challenge will be on the grid.
Absolutely.
I'll be fascinated to see how the grid supplies it when you've got basically hundreds of thousands of vehicles which are their own electrical storage system, somehow plugging in and out the grid. How we're going to manage that, that's going to be absolutely fascinating.
And I think this is where you get to the technology point, where if you've got the right technology there that can optimise it across the grid, and it kind of changed people's mindsets for them. This is sounding a bit kind of like the information technology taking over. But, you know, people talk about everyone getting home from work and plugging their cars in and charging them up, and the load that's going to create on the grid. That won't happen if the technology's there, because, yeah, they might plug their car in, but the technology might say, well, actually, you don't need it until lunchtime tomorrow. Yeah. And you don't need to charge your full battery. You only need to, you know, to charge 20% of it for what you need, because it's learning your habits and things. So that's why I'm such a big believer in the technology.
You'll do that on an app, won't you?
Yeah,
you'll do it on an app sitting down. You'll have the charge of your car and how much you need to charge for your journey, or put where your journey's going in, and it'll figure out how much you're going to charge, and that's the way it's going to work. How we need to figure out a charging mechanism for that, like a cost mechanism, that's going to be a bit more of a challenge.
We've already seen some people in that kind of mindset say Grid's worked with the WWF and Environmental Defence Fund to create a website called Carbon Intensity, and it predicts the carbon intensity of the grid for the next 3 days coming up. And it's all on an open access API, so you can build an app and plug into it. And we're already seeing people that are building their own apps. I've got no idea. I'm a big proponent of technology. I can't actually do it, but there's lots of people building apps and plugging them into our API, and then changing how they use electricity in their home based on when it's greenest, because it's important to them. And I think that's where you come into the change in culture, and the younger generations coming through have got different objectives.
So is this the death of baseload? Do we no longer need? Does the grid think it needs baseload? Do other people think we?
It's an interesting one, that, isn't it? Because the supply side and the demand side are becoming more flexible. So this sort of concept of, you know, building a power plant, switching it on and turn it off, you know, 40 years later is becoming sort of less attractive in that context. So yeah, I think for a while we will have some base load. Looks like we're going to commit to some more. But there certainly is a limit.
Hopefully not at £92.50 for 35 years.
Indeed. But you know, I think it is starting to become questionable as a concept. You know, what we need is a flexible system, and certainly if you look at the potential for renewables, offshore wind in particular, it is enormous. And if you had that as the backbone of your electricity system, almost the last thing you need is an inflexible resource to sort of back that up. You need a dispatchable, flexible resource to deal with, you know, on the odd occasion when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. So I don't think it's a necessarily good complement for where we're heading, although I can understand arguments as to why you need some very low level at the current time. But it'd be super interesting as we further decentralise and get more flexible on the demand side, quite whether we need baseload in the same form as we have today. I think it's arguable.
I would worry until we've sorted out the intensive users, which include heat, because that's an intensive use, whether we then assess whether we need baseload at that point in time, because that's going to be the, you know, we talk of electric cars, but actually that's not the problem. Heat is an intensive grid usage. And how are we going to solve that? I think we need to just think of how to... Once we've got the resolution for that, then I think we can answer whether we need baseload.
Claire's looking more relaxed than you are.
Well, I
She didn't have as much to drink as I did last time.
I think I would expect the definition of baseload to change. So when we say baseload now, we think conventional thermal generation, but actually offshore wind has got on average a 40% load factor.
50.
In the peak, in the winter. I think on average it's 40, a lot of the time it's 50. It's pretty predictable as well.
Yep.
Compared even to offshore wind compared to onshore wind is much more predictable. It's not, when people talk about intermittent generation, these stats don't fit with the definitions. So I think the definitions and what we think of as baseload will change.
And have you got any thoughts on what sort of level of interconnection you would like us to see by 2030? Is that helpful, particularly in...
I think every technology brings its benefits and its challenges, and interconnectors are no different. So obviously from a security supply point of view and megawatts, they have a benefit. From a management of the system and how fast an interconnector can change its position, it's a different challenge to deal with. I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to put a number on what level of interconnection we see. We will definitely see more than we've got today, but I don't think I'd be surprised if all of the interconnection that's currently being talked about comes to fruition.
I was going to say the government has up to 11 megawatts in the Clean Growth Plan for 2030. Which is, it's about 4 today, isn't it?
Yeah,
4 gigawatts, sorry.
4 gigawatts
Gigawatt,
today. I mean that's a rapid expansion, and you know, all of every technology type has its own different political challenges, and interconnectors are no different. So I think it's a bit of a watch this space on it.
It might depend on how friendly we are with the other members of the EU, who we're hoping might be on the other end of the interconnectors, of course. Yes. Okay, well, I'm going to ask our audience how they would like to quiz you for the last 10 minutes or so. But perhaps also you might be thinking while we do that, whether you have one last thought you'd like to leave people with at the end after we've... But I hope we've got this great panel here. I hope you've got lots of questions for them. So, my problem is I can't see you very well. Who wants to ask the first one? You're all desperate for coffee. A lady in a green cardigan. Excellent.
Hi there, my name's Morna Cannon. I work at the Department for Transport. I think, Claire, you said it was your job to turn the oil tanker. My job is to decarbonise the oil tanker. Some of you might know we've just agreed internationally a global target to reduce greenhouse gases from international shipping by 50% by 2050. That represents a really big potential market for decarbonisation solutions, and I've been really interested to hear what the panel has been saying about storage, ammonia, hydrogen, and also about the opportunities presented by electric vehicles. I just kind of wanted to raise the flag and kind of promote the concept of electric vessels and raise the possibility of thinking about how we work with offshore wind as an opportunity to kind of fit in with decarbonising a whole new transport sector globally. And I'd be interested to talk to anyone in the panel and anyone in the room about the opportunities kind of going forward in this space. Interested to hear if the panel is thinking about this already.
So, decarbonising marine, there's an exciting challenge. Matthew, are you about to kick us off?
Yeah, really interesting opportunity. A couple of things spring to mind. One is certainly looking at the vessels that we are increasingly looking at to service our offshore wind farms. That is starting to become a feature in them, and ABB offer some packages on vessels to a bit like a sort of a hybrid sort of vehicle, but for vessels, and that's something we're super interested in. We run a competition at Ørsted every year called the Innovation Games, and the winner in one of the categories this year was looking at decarbonising vessels when they're in port, and sort of instead of connecting to the grid, putting a battery on board and sort of further decarbonising. So it is something we're really interested in, and again, world that runs entirely on green energy, something that our company would be very, very happy to support.
Clark, are you?
Well, we're doing something similar actually, because we also run small vessels, although big tankers I'm not 100% sure of. Anybody with an installation vessel maybe we need to have a chat about, or a DP2SOV vessel, but certainly we've started small. And we're working with some of the CTV suppliers. But maybe there's a challenge to us as an industry to think about how we're working. We have helicopters in our industry. Are we talking to them? When was the first electrically powered plane flight over Britain? Do you know that? It was last August.
Oh, last August.
Yeah. So these technologies are being developed, and maybe we just need to link in with them more as an industry.
This is how you can combine floating wind. You can have a kind of a fuel station out there on your way to Atlantic in 2040. So build up a big fuel station for cruise ships or big vessels. So and definitely also other fuels like or doing hydrogen out of this is something we're looking at, but it's an early stage.
You'll be having the battery swap facility that Better Place were trying to develop for cars some years ago out in the sea. It sounds very exciting. Any other issues people want to raise while we have these people here? Gentleman over there. Anyone else?
Hi, Lorne Gifford. Personally, I think connectivity is the key. It's very much like the internet, which didn't take off until everything was connected together. And I see the grid as being the most fundamental part of increasing not only wind power, but renewables as a whole. And not just the UK grid, tying that grid into the rest of Europe through all these interconnectors. You agree?
That's an interesting thought. Claire?
I agree. I think you're exactly right. The components need to be there, both from a grid point of view and tying together the technology, but the kind of the technology and facilitating that we've talked about. All of the components need to be there, because if people start trying to do it and it's difficult, they just lose interest quite quickly. So the components have to be there, and you have to tie it all together. So yes, I agree. Grid's actually been publishing some roadmaps over the last few months, which are focused very much around grid services, so reactive power and frequency response and things. But that is part of that step to try and show how we're trying to pull things together, so that as and when the technology or the innovation gets there, then we're ahead of it rather than behind it.
And do you see a much more interactive form of interconnection with other grids? Or is it mainly you think that'll be a UK development, a development sort of within our grid?
Potentially, I think as your interconnection increases, you've got to understand how that operates with the other grids. And I mean, with the interconnectors we've got now, it's interesting because you get a very different situation on the end of one compared to the end of the other, and they're not that far apart in continental Europe. So as you get more of them, then I think it will be more interactive. There's lots of European rules kind of in the progress of being implemented in GB at the minute to try and deal with those types of things. But quite a lot of the time, all of that kind of stuff comes down to the control rooms on the phone to each other, you know.
I think there's two elements to this. So I think you're right technically, but interconnectivity is part of it. And as I mentioned, that there are other European countries that can run 100% renewables, but they do run it with interconnectivity as a support. But if we're going to use interconnectivity, then there is a commercial model challenge to us within the renewable energy. We know that goes into capacity auction. That's a very different industry from ourselves. And how to then get renewables reflected within that commercial model. A debate for another day, but it's not a simple equation.
So, I get any fierce messages that say we have to finish at 11 o'clock prompt. So, one last comment, one last thought you would each like to leave the audience with, and if it can be quite short, that would be helpful. So,
I think that for kind of I wouldn't say for floating perspective, we really hope that we can get the kind of a voice into the sector deal and be part of whether it's innovation or one of these kind of cluster thinking we're looking into now. But I think it's key for the innovation and for the kind of future of offshore wind in the UK. So that's a key message from Equinor today.
thank you. Grant.
I'd like to make a request if I could, Julie. Hugh was here. I mean, I'm one of the core team working on the sector deal. I'm very much looking at the supply chain, and I could really do with what you could offer, what your barriers are, how can we get to 30 gigawatts to make sure that I'm representing everybody within the industry, within the sector deal, and not just my own company or my own ideas. So please come and tell me what you need.
Thank you. Claire.
So I would say, hopefully you've got the message from me that this, from our point of view, this is exciting, not scary. And I would also make a request as well, which is to expand your innovative thinking. So the way you're thinking innovatively about technologies and deployments and where you can cut costs and things like that. Doing exactly what we said earlier. Think differently about your business and how your business runs and how you bank the business case, but also think about working with Grid or the DNOs or whoever it is and trying to solve some of the problems around integration together rather than leaving them to someone else.
Okay. Matthew, finally.
Yeah, my thought really was something a little different, and it's interesting you sort of come on these panels and you sort of try to answer questions, but the truth is we don't have all of the answers, which, as I said earlier, I just find super exciting. So, my thought is that what a fantastic industry to get people interested in. We're running a skills hub here today, which is about trying to get younger people sort of excited about the renewable energy sector as a place where they want to come and work. And because we don't have all the answers, and because of the element of unpredictability, for me, that's what makes it so exciting. So, I like the fact that we can't answer all the questions. It'd be boring if we could.
Well, on that very positive note, can I ask you to thank our panel in the usual way and as loudly as possible?